increase could force small businesses to employ fewer workers. Insider's host Barry Cassidy says Labor has not explained how it would boost wages if it wins the election.
Bill Shorten is talking about the living wage. He's not putting a figure on it. The ACTU has helped him out with that, and it's quite significant. Way too far, I think, for an incoming Labor government to meet them. They might have to meet them halfway. But how do you do it? And that's still the biggest question: is do you intervene in the market? Do you legislate? How do you bring about a wage rise? Because that's not something that governments control. So. People, I think, are entitled to say, show me the money, but he can't show them the money before the election. He's in opposition. What he has to do is demonstrate how he can show them the money after the election. So far, he hasn't done that, and what he's saying is that he'll deal with that in the next few days.
And Alison Pennington is an economist at the Centre for Future Work, and she joins us now from Adelaide. Alison Pennington, welcome. So Bill Shorten is saying this election will be a referendum on wages. He's saying Labor will get wages moving again. With the wages infrastructure that we have in Australia, to what extent is it possible for a government to do that?
So I think, first of all, we have to recognise that nominal wages are in the slowest period of growth since the end of the Second World War, and real wages have been declining the last 5 years. We have an absolute wages crisis in Australia, so it is right and correct to say that we should make this coming election, one on wages growth. And this is where calls from Labor advocates and academics and many specialists and experts in the area is around how do we actually look at changing the way that our employment relations framework functions to enable wage increases, because at this point we have excuse me, I'm just going to put this one in. There's an absolute contradiction in the government's story about what their approach to wages is at the moment. So we say we wait for market forces. That's been Morrison's perspective, and then we heard Minister Cormann say the other day that actually low wages are a design feature. So the question is absolutely one of how do we talk about intervening to set a new benchmark and new norms about that change the behaviour of employers to ensure that Australians can earn adequate wages and ensure that we actually have some macroeconomic stability, because slow wages growth is a huge problem for consumer spending, which makes up 60% of our GDP.
Yeah, and so when Bill Shorten has brought this up before, saying Labor will get wages moving again, he's mentioned a couple of things, so we'll run through them. He's saying restoring penalty rates will be a priority. Will that be straightforward, and how many people will that affect?
So the penalty rate cuts that came through last year, I believe, they affect workers within the hospitality and retail sectors. And so our research actually shows that those cuts did not have any positive employment effects. They did not lead to higher levels of jobs. In fact, actually, we saw a decrease in jobs. So lifting wages and boosting wages is about sending a signal to employers about why it is that they can invest and have some more security actually in the incomes that they depend on for their own businesses. So the wages of workers in those industries often go quite quickly flow into those industries as well. So that will affect, I imagine, a few 100,000 workers if we do restore penalty rates.
Yeah. And will that be straightforward enough for a government to do that, or is that an independent umpire that decides on that?
Yeah, so the discussion is around what must be done by government to ensure that the rules that set the Fair Work Commission's rulings around minimum wages, they may need to change. So at the moment, the minimum wage objective in the Fair Work Act requires the Fair Work Commission to consider the relative standards of living of workers, but only in the same, no weighting is given more to that than weighting to business profitability, business viability. So it's quite easy for an employer association to make any kind of recommendations to say, look, this is going to affect us, and the fact is it will affect businesses. But what will have to happen is that Labor will have to intervene into the minimum wage objective in the Fair Work Act and change the weighting to ensure that when the Fair Work Commission makes their decisions about what should be happening and when they set their wages, to ensure that they're actually focused on making sure, for instance, that a full-time worker in Australia does not live in poverty, and we don't have that protection at the moment.
Okay, now Bill Shorten also lists clamping down on dodgy labour hire as a policy move. How effective is that likely to be, and how many people would that benefit?
Labour hire is rampant across many industries in Australia. Intervening to stop dodgy labour hire is about taking away the incentive that currently exists. That means that one employer can employ a layer of workers, and then they have a contract with a secondary employer, and in that process of providing recruitment and labour services, they would take a cut from that, and that cut often comes out of, it's going to be cutting out wages because their main input is a worker. So that's when we're saying clamp down on labour hire, it's about taking away this current system that allows a whole layer of the employers in the labour hire industry to profit from undercutting the wages.
And so are we talking about hundreds of thousands of workers benefiting from that as well, or is the figure as big as that?
I don't believe labour hire affects that many hundreds of thousands, but it would be a decent amount. Like, we definitely have very high levels in Australia compared to other countries.
And another Labor initiative that Bill Shorten talks about when he says Labor will get wages moving again is protecting subcontractors from exploitative practices. What needs to happen in that area, and how many people would that affect? So
the subcontracting issue is one of, Australia has very high levels of independent contracting. So that's people who are working as though they were employees. So I should say, in some instances, they are genuinely independently contracting, but quite often it's a process where employers dish out a bunch of ABNs to their workforce, and they say, look, you are all independently, you're an independent contractor now. And what we've seen in our research at the Centre for Future Work is that the majority of people who would classify in the data as independent contractors are actually much closer to employees. And so by not having access to that secure employment relationship, they don't have access to superannuation, annual leave, sick leave when they're unwell, and all the protections that we would expect in Australia around employment. So if we start looking at how we define an employee and reopening up this discussion about the definition of employment, one that actually allows us to look at the conditions of independent contractors and say, actually, you should be classified as an employee. This could affect, again, I imagine tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers as well. So, it's an important, a very important area of employment law as well.
And so those are three things that Bill Shorten mentions when he brings up this effort to bring the focus on wages. So what is the extent then of the effect that a Shorten government would be able to have on the take-home pay of Australians?
Right. So, I mean, the minimum wage, if an incoming Labor government was to intervene into the minimum wage objective, this would flow on to affect millions of workers.
And when you say intervene, you make as you mentioned before, legislative changes.
I think we should be wary of the use of the word intervention anyway. I think government intervention is always shaped as this hazardous thing that gets in the way of some natural market force, but actually Australia has a very long tradition of ensuring that our employment relations framework and even our independent umpires are operating in such a way that we have a principles-based approach, which is that workers shouldn't live in poverty and workers should earn enough to have a decent standard of living. And that is because there's been a recognition in our history that strong wages are actually in the interest collectively of even businesses. And that's why if we have a whole set of individual employers who are acting in their own interests in an aggregate, what that looks like is Australia right now, which is wages stagnation and macroeconomic instability. And that's why we have to intervene, if we use that word, but it's just about setting a new set of rules that all actors in our economy, businesses, workers, organisations alike, must all be a part of following in the interest of everyone. It's a collective interest.
Yeah, so if Bill Shorten is to achieve these claims that he's making before the election as Prime Minister, if he becomes Prime Minister, there are clearly then going to have to be legislative changes and fundamental changes to the focus of the wages infrastructure in Australia?
Yes, absolutely. So that's where calls from organisations like the ACTU and the Australian Union say the current legislation as it's functioning, that's the Fair Work Act, it's failing to provide enough infrastructure, enough of a framework and enough an incentive structure for all actors in the industrial relations climate to ensure that wages are adequate, economic growth is stable. And so Australia has, we've had elections on industrial relations legislation in the past. We only have to think about work choices and the election of the Rudd and then Gillard government around an industrial relations environment. And I think this is what we're seeing is we're coming to the same sorts of crossroads, the same sorts of contradictions and problems, and that do require positive, proactive, wage-boosting interventions from the government to ensure that our economy continues to tick over, that workers earn enough in their wage. So this is, while it's the hot topic and it rightfully should be at the forefront of our election campaign, it's not an unusual occurrence for us to start talking about what's a better way to be doing this.
Yeah. Okay, Alison Pennington, thanks so much for talking to us. Really interesting having a chat to you, and thanks for persisting even though you're having a few issues with that earpiece there.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and we've just heard that Brendan O'Connor, the Labor's